Hello and welcome. This is India Sense. I'm Gaurie, Dwivedi. And before we get you the headlines, viewers, this week onwards, you can now get all the stories, all the big interviews of India Sense by scanning the QR code flashing on your screens right now. Let's get going with the show for headlines. First up, Prime Minister Modi and his big three-nation tour comes to an end.
Culture, cuisine and cricket.
After co-chairing India-Caribbean Community Summit, holding bilateral talks and interacting with the Indian community, Prime Minister Modi wraps up the warm and productive Guyana visit and the historic three-nation tour. Another embarrassing flip-flop by Trudeau's government. Ottawa slams the shocking report that linked Prime Minister Modi and External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar and the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to criminal activities on Canadian soil. Same song and dance at COP29 all over again as countries fail to reach consensus over climate financing for developing countries. Winds of change on the horizon in Asia after India-China discuss resumption of direct flights and the Mansarovar Yatra following diplomatic thaw post the border disengagement. Prime Minister Modi and UK's Keir Starmer announced relaunch of the UK-India free trade talks early 2025 after months of delay due to elections in both the countries. And Eurasia Group's president and founder Ian Bremmer breaks down Trump 2.0 and what's next in this exclusive conversation with NDTV. All right, the big story on India Sense this week. Prime Minister Modi is returning to India after a three-nation tour which included Guyana and Brazil for G20. And the first stop for Prime Minister Modi in this trip was Nigeria. The visit is the latest in a series of measures that's aimed to boost India's presence, influence and stakes in Africa. In fact, a continent which is now fast becoming an epicenter of the power tussle that's taking place between Africa's former colonizers, China, and countries like India that enjoy enormous goodwill. This report tells you the stakes that are there for India in Africa.
भारत की प्रगति से आप खुश होते हैं और यहाँ आपकी प्रगति पर हर भारतवासी का सीना चौड़ा हो जाता है.
In 1884, the Berlin Conference kicked off the scramble for Africa. Between European nations, UK, Germany, France, Portugal, Belgium and others that divided the continent amongst them, known for its rich resources and access to trade routes. Fast forward to now, where the former colonial powers are struggling to be relevant as players like India gain ground. Between 1992 and 2022, India's trade with Africa rose from $890 million to $98 billion. African Union is now India's fourth largest trading partner, with Nigeria accounting for almost a fifth of this. Nigeria is witnessing significant Indian investments in steel, power generation, petrochemical and defense production. And it's not just Nigeria. Indian investments are focused in the 6 lion economies, or those that have high growth rates and prospects like the Asian tigers 4 decades back. China remains one of the largest investors in Africa, pumping in $170 billion in the last 2 decades. But India is catching up. Indian investments are projected to touch $150 billion by 2030, While some of Chinese investments have been very strategic in nature, like the Djibouti to Addis Ababa railway line, the backlash due to debt trap concerns is allowing India a unique opportunity to come in with its investments and funds that allow Africa and African economies to prosper.
Now, China's loans to Africa have fallen from $28 billion in 2016 to under $1 billion in 2022, telling the scope that lies for India and the opportunity. But it's not just about investments. India appointed defense attaches to important countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, Ivory Coast, and Djibouti, where China owns a large port. And these appointments indicate the intent to increase strategic engagements and boost defense production. This is the reason why Africa matters so much to India for its strategic, geopolitical, and long-term ambitions. Now, is this the beginning of a new era in Asia? After years of tension, clashes and mistrust, the world's two largest countries, that is India and China, are now attempting to, what one may say, rewriting their story. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, in fact, sat down with his Chinese counterpart for their first meeting since the military disengagement in Ladakh earlier this week in Laos. Not only this, in fact, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar also met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi on the sidelines of the Rio G20 summit in Brazil. The stakes, in fact, couldn't have been higher. And the question remains, are these two giants of Asia finally heading towards peace and growth, or is this just another blip given the fact that there are still thorny issues that need to be resolved? The very fact that the two defense ministers were able to sit down and talk after the violent clashes 4 years back in Galwan Valley is nothing short of what one may see as remarkable. Coast of Galwan, of course, still remain, and there's good reason for that. And in fact, we'll tell you exactly what Defense Minister also said, that quote that is flashing on your screens. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh made it clear to his counterpart, the Chinese counterpart, that Galwan-like incidents must be avoided at all costs. A firm stance, a clear message: India is no longer willing to let its guard down. That's essentially what the big message was. And in the world of geopolitics, these are not just words, they are the foundations for future relations. And Defense Minister's statement highlight New Delhi's refusal to roll over when it comes to any Chinese aggression. India's military response to China's expansionist ambitions in Ladakh was a pivotal moment. It wasn't just a boundary dispute, it was a check on the dragon's regional power play, a wake-up call that the tiger wouldn't just lie down. And now, as the dust settles, both sides are looking at a new horizon. The latest round of talks follows a crucial meeting that took place between Dr. Jaishankar and his Chinese counterpart in the Foreign Ministry on the sidelines of the G20 summit. These discussions focused on economic cooperation, border security, and further evidence that both sides are willing to now take the discussion forward, given that now ties are out of the freeze. Not only this, both nations have agreed to explore resuming direct flights, and a move that could reinvigorate both trade, tourism, and of course people-to-people ties. They're also looking at kick-starting the Kailash Mansarovar, a very important pilgrimage visit for India. In fact, now the question is this a diplomatic thaw, or is it a turning point as far as India-China relations? The Chinese Foreign Ministry has called it, quote-unquote, a starting point, a new starting point for the bilateral partnership. But as any seasoned diplomat knows, there is a lot more as far as these comments are concerned. But the tip of the iceberg, really, the real test will be as to what will follow from here on. And that is really the key question to watch out for. That will India and China, will it be a mix of cooperation, or will there also be some competition? And that could happen given the fact that they will have to work together when it comes to Trump tariffs. They will have to collaborate given the fact that they have common goals regarding trade. They will possibly compete when it comes to regional supremacy in Asia. And at times there could be confrontation, which cannot be ruled out given their border disputes. Well, the clock is ticking and the pressure is mounting quite literally when it comes to COP29. Another breaking point it has reached. Developed countries are dodging the question yet again. How much climate finance are they willing to put up on the table to ensure that developing countries can progress? They can address their climate challenges, they can meet the common climate goals, and also ensure that they can avoid the climate catastrophes. Negotiations have hit a standstill, nothing new, something that happens year on year. Take a look at this report that tells you what's different this time around, except for possibly more expectations and hope.
The gloves are off at COP29. After days of intense discussions, a stunning breakdown has left the summit tethering on the edge of disaster. In a move that has shocked the world, all countries have rejected the latest climate finance draft, plunging the summit into chaos. The central issue? A simple yet unsettling question. How much money will the developed world commit to help the global south face the climate crisis after 2025?
Is not yet guaranteed.
The developing world has made their demands clear. At least $1.3 trillion per year to combat escalating climate disasters. That's 13 times the $100 billion pledged back in 2009, a promise that was never fully met. Yet, despite the urgency, rich nations continue to play the old game of cat and mouse, dodging responsibility and leaving the most vulnerable in the lurch.
What do we want?
Meanwhile, negotiators have been mulling over numbers at yet another cozy retreat. Unfortunately, nothing close to what's needed. The European Union is proposing a target of $200 to $300 billion a year. But that's a mere drop in the ocean compared to the trillions the developing world needs. For the global south, this is old hat, another round of broken promises and empty words. As they watch the rich nations circle the wagons, it's clear that the climate finance conversation is once again stuck in a loop of hogwash. The proposed sums fall far short of the mark, and as the impact of climate change continues to wreak havoc, the rich world seems content to sit pretty.
When Prime Minister Modi is launching a scheme for 10 million or 1 crore rooftop solar plants in India, that matters. But the climate talks, so to say, have limited significance.
This latest impasse raises serious questions about the commitment of wealthy nations. The gap between what's needed and what's being offered is widening by the day, and the clock is ticking. If the rich nations don't come to the table with a serious offer, the consequences could be catastrophic. For the developing world, the stakes couldn't be higher. If COP29 fails to deliver, it won't just be another summit gone wrong. It will be a devastating blow to the planet's future. But right now, it feels more like a storm on the horizon, with the clock ticking down and no solution in sight. As the negotiators scramble, the question remains, will they rise to the challenge, or will they be remembered as just another footnote in the long history of climate inaction? With Arjun Samar Mahindran, Bureau Report, NDTV World.
All right, we're slipping into a very short break. We come back on the other side and get you the big voice this week on India Sense. Ian Bremmer on what Donald Trump's second round means at Oval Office for India. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching India Sense. It's time to get you the big voice on the show this week. Top political scientist and global thinkers Ian Bremmer speaks to me on India Sense on what does Trump 2.0 mean going forward for the world and, of course, for India. Mr. Bremmer, thank you so much for taking out the time speaking to me on NDTV. My first question to you, sir, is the fact that we're speaking at a time when there is now greater alignment that's taking place. You have Russia, Iran, China, North Korea essentially becoming more close in terms of cooperation. What does this mean for Donald Trump as he comes to power 2 months from now?
Well, it would have shaped Biden's policies or Harris' policies a lot more than Trump's policies. Trump is not particularly interested in what kind of a political system you have. He's just as happy to cut deals with authoritarians as he is with Democrats, where Biden talked about a world between democracies and autocracies, the good guys versus the bad guys. Trump doesn't see it that way at all. He actually thinks that anyone that's willing to cut a deal with him, he'll cut a deal with. He'll do it one-on-one because he's more powerful than the other countries sitting in a room by themselves. Now, Trump is willing to cut a deal with the Russians, and he's much more willing than any other American president would have been. He's also willing to cut a deal with the Chinese. Now, he's going to put more tariffs on China, and he has appointed a number of China hawks in his administration waiting for confirmation. But the fact is that if the Chinese are willing to cut him a good economic deal, even a good diplomatic and military deal, Trump is much more likely to accept it than other leaders would be. So I don't think Trump is particularly bothered. Look, Trump is not someone that even cares about a strong Europe. He doesn't like the EU. He wants to deal with individual European leaders. Most American presidents would think that a strong European Union in a global order that's more chaotic and fragmented would be good for the United States. Trump doesn't. Trump thinks a strong EU is a competitor to the United States. He wants it to fragment. So in many ways, U.S. foreign policy is becoming more Chinese in orientation. What I mean by that, less about common values, very tactical, very transactional, and really eschewing multilateral sort of environments in favor of one-on-one negotiations where the Americans or where the Chinese are more powerful.
Okay. But specifically in terms of appointments that Trump administration has been making, what does this signify for India?
The Indians are one of the few countries in the world that was set to have a very strong relationship with the United States, whether or not Kamala Harris or Donald Trump won. Some of that is about the reality that U.S.-China relations are poor, lack trust, and that there are a lot of American corporations that are starting to de-risk, as they like to call it, their exposure from China, and a lot of that investment is moving into India. The Indian economy is growing much faster, and it's a fairly large economy than any other major economy in the world, so it's a more attractive destination for trade and for investment. There's a lot of well-educated people that can work with the United States in technology sphere, which is very important. Also you have a reality that you've got a lot of diplomatic alignment between the countries, a lot of trust that you've built with new architecture, particularly the Quad. So all of that is positive. Having said that, Trump does not like trade surpluses in other countries' favor, and he will be interested in increasing tariffs against Indian goods unless he gets transactional benefits, just like he will against other allies around the world.
Okay. So barring the trade tariff issue, do you think a Trump 2.0 would actually be positive and very good for India?
Absolutely. I think in every other aspect, except for the long-term aspect. I mean, long-term, India is a country that would benefit from more global governance. You probably know at the COP29 summit in Baku this week, the Americans haven't been doing very much. Trump isn't interested in putting money into a global loss and damages fund that would allow the developed countries to pay for the costs of climate change and industrialization that are going to be borne by poorer countries like India, like Southeast Asia, like the sub-Saharan African countries. Of course, that's a problem for India. I mean, if India wants to continue to industrialize, It needs accountable and responsible partners that care about global leadership, that care about 1.5 billion Indians in the world and not just their own populations. Trump doesn't. Trump's America First policy is India somewhat later when they think about it, and not our problem. And long term, a United States that doesn't care about the values in the UN Charter or in the World Bank or in the IMF or in any of these multilateral agencies, those are problems for the Indians long term.
Okay. So would that mean that under a Trump administration, India's aspiration to be a permanent member at the UNSC could probably become that much farther from the goal?
So his appointee for ambassador to the UN has no particular interest in the UN, no experience, and certainly isn't a fan of it. I think there's a lot of concern in the UN, including from the Secretary General personally, that a Trump administration would stop paying dues from the United States to the United Nations. Now, that's going to be a weaker UN. Is a weaker UN with an absent United States, is that a place where India might have more ability to play a role? At the structural level, yes, because if India is willing to, have more involvement with peacekeeping, for example, with refugee support, for example, an organization like UNRWA that the Americans have pulled out of, India will be able to have a lot more influence at the UN. But the Security Council is broken, and an American veto is a unilateral ability to prevent reform, which I expect that the Trump administration will wield repeatedly. So in that regard, I think India can have more influence in the UN structure, just like China has had more influence over the past years. India should do a lot more at the UN and with the UN, but not in the Security Council, in my view.
Okay, given the focus that a Trump administration is expected to have on China, how does this fit in with the recent thaw that India has seen with its relationship with China?
We don't yet know exactly what the economic ministries in the U.S. will be, and that will determine how hard the Americans pursue the 60% tariffs on China they've been talking about, which could cause an immediate crisis. Certainly under Trump, there is the possibility of a Cold War with China. You would see a more hawkish orientation by incoming Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, on issues like Taiwan, for example, on U.S. national security and technology vis-a-vis China. And if you're India, that means you have a better relationship with the U.S., but it also means that you're getting pushed more to take a more hawkish stand on China, which happens to be the largest trade relationship that India has in the world. So again, on balance, if you're India, you want peace, you want global stability, you want to be the friends of everybody, and the Trump administration does make that a little bit harder.
Okay. All right. All right, Mr. Bremmer, thank you so much for speaking to me and decoding what Trump 2.0 could mean for India. All right, shifting focus now to a story coming in from Canada. Quick take on Canada. In a dramatic turn of events, the Justin Trudeau-led government facing a storm of controversy after denying a shocking report that linked Prime Minister Modi, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar, and National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to criminal activities on Canadian soil. Not only this, Ottawa has lifted the additional security screening measures for travellers to India, which were implemented earlier this week. This comes just days after a strong rebuttal from New Delhi, calling the allegations speculative and inaccurate. But the damage has been done. Canada now finds itself caught between two opposing forces, a flip-flop of monumental proportions. For the Trudeau government, the truth seems as elusive as a needle in a haystack, and critics are calling it a desperate attempt to quell growing diplomatic tensions. The heat is on, and with tensions rising, all eyes are now on how Trudeau and his government will navigate this delicate minefield. All right, with that, it's a wrap on this edition of India Sense. Viewers, do not forget to tune in to all that has happened in India Sense. You can catch that entire playlist by scanning the QR code on your screens. Thanks so much for watching this episode.